Welcome to episode 23, where we'll learn how to create functions or reusable blocks of code making use of JavaScript. So, in short, functions are basically procedures that can be used to repeatedly perform complex tasks. And the reason why they're needed is because they help abstract the code, or in other words, make it appear simpler by hiding details that are really advanced or not very applicable to what the code's actually doing. So let's say, as an example, I wanted to create a function that prints out something specific in the console. So in order to do that, I could create a function by clicking on this function here that appears in the auto completion. And now, as you can see, we get this template for creating a function. And as you can see, the function has a name and it has parameters. We'll first start by creating a function without any parameters. And we'll call this function print pattern because that's what we're going to be doing. And then, so let's say for this pattern, we wanted to print out 3 boxes using ASCII art or ASCII characters. So in order to do that, we can use a for loop and make it run the code 3 times to generate 3 boxes in the console. And so from there we can do console.log and then our text. So in this case, I'm just going to indent it backwards so that the indentation doesn't mess with the string that's printed out. And so from here, I'm going to do a simple pattern here. So it'll be 5 by 5 on the inside. So it'll be something like this with 5 dashes in between 2 asterisks at the start and the end. And then add 5 lines of vertical bars. And now if we run the code, you can see nothing happens. This is because we still need to call the function. If we just define the function on its own without doing anything with it, then it won't do anything. And so the way we can call the function is by selecting the name of the function, which in this case is print pattern, and then putting a pair of parentheses and then a semicolon at the end. Before we run the code one more time, I'm going to add another console.log statement just to break up each box so that we can visibly see each box in the console. And now if we run the code, you can see 3 boxes get printed out. So basically what we're doing here is we're defining a new procedure inside the JavaScript here, and it has some code inside it that'll be run every time this function or procedure is called. Like this, making use of the name of the function and then a pair of parentheses to call it. And so the benefit of doing this, as opposed to just using a for loop normally without a function, is if you want to write this code, want to run this code multiple times. So let's say I were to move the for loop out so that when I run it, the box only prints one time. Then I can move the for loop to the outside, and then I can put this print pattern function call inside of the for loop. So that way I can print it out 5 times or any number of times that I want. However, right now this function isn't really very useful as we can't really control what it does through our own input, which means this function does exactly the same thing every time. So in order to solve this problem, we can make use of function parameters, which allow us to input data inside the function and make it do different things based on what we give to the function as a parameter. So let's say we wanted to print a number in the middle of this box, and we have to provide that number. So we can add a new parameter inside the parentheses in this function definition here. And then we can access this number as just a normal variable. It's similar to a variable, except it's only accessible within this function and nowhere else. And so what we can do in that case is just put this number parameter and interpolate it into this string right here so that it appears exactly in the middle. And so now, let's say we were to call it with the number 1. So in this case, num would be equal to 1. So then 1 would appear in the middle of this box right here. So we can test that. And you can see 1 appears in the middle of the box. And then we can do other numbers like 4 or 9. And you can see it works with whatever number I put in. And so this shows how functions can be pretty useful because they allow you to process input in a more convenient way. However, let's say I wanted to print the sum of 2 different numbers inside this box right here. Well, then I could make use of 2 parameters instead of just 1. And so the first one could be num1, and the second could be num2. And then instead of just, and the way we specify 2 parameters is by separating them with commas. And theoretically, we could add more parameters just by using more commas like num3 and num4, but we're just using 2 for this example, so we can just leave it like this for our use case. And so then we want to print out the sum of these numbers, so it'll be num1 plus num2. And so now, when calling the function, we have to specify 2 numbers, not just 1. So let's say I wanted to do the sum of 3 and 4. I can separate these 2 numbers with commas just like before. And if we run the code, you can see 3 plus 4, which is 7, is printed out inside this box. So this shows how functions can give you even greater control of what happens through multiple parameters right here. It doesn't have to be just one, but you can take as many inputs as you need. Now, printing out boxes with numbers inside is pretty interesting, but there are also cases where instead of doing something that's actually visible to the user, maybe you just want to make a calculation, for example, and then return the result. This is a case where we can use return values, which are useful when data should be directly returned from the function. So for this example, let's say I don't want to print a pattern anymore, and instead I just want to return, let's say, the product of the two numbers, for example. So then I can rename this function to product to make it slightly more descriptive of what it's doing. And then the way that we can return a value is by making use of the return keyword. And then in this case, we want to return the product of num1 and num2. So for the expression that we want to return, we can just say num1 times num2. And we still have the same two parameters here. So if we were to run the code, you can see that nothing happens because nothing's actually being printed out. It's just that 3 times 4 is just being calculated. And so the way that we can actually take this value and use it is by creating a new variable. So we can say this variable is 3 times 4, and then we can print it out making use of console.log. And now you can see the result equals 12. And that's exactly what it should be because 3 times 4 is equal to 12. And so this shows how functions aren't just useful for printing out stuff to the console or displaying things to the user. They're also good for just making calculations that are repeatedly made with different inputs. Now let's take a look at how we can customize parameters more. So currently you can see this function takes 2 parameters and we're passing in 2 parameters. But what if we pass in only 1 parameter? Well, in this case, it doesn't give us a result because if we don't pass in a parameter for num2, then it'll basically be automatically filled in with undefined, an undefined value, which is why it's giving us nan, or not a number. And if it were to have more than 2 parameters, a different number, and we just give in a number of parameters that's less than what is required, all the other parameters that we didn't give will automatically be filled in with undefined. And so let's say for this example that we wanted the num2 parameter to be optional and that it's not required, but if we want to, we can specify another number for num2. And so the way we can do that is by assigning a default value for num2. And we do that by making use of the equal sign after the parameter name, which in this case is num2. And then after the equal sign, we'll assign it a default value that'll be given to it if we don't explicitly specify num2 in the function call. So in this case, I'm just going to give 1 so that it just returns num1 times 1, so that it just returns the first number. And so now you can see if I give product of 3 and 4, it still returns 12. But if I don't specify 4, it's still okay because num2 just automatically gets filled in with 1. However, let's say that instead of just taking the product of 2 numbers, we wanted to take the product of all the numbers given to us. Not just two numbers, but it could be any amount of numbers. And so the way we can do that is by using rest parameters, which are represented by 3 periods like this, and then the name of the array of parameters. So in this case, it can just be called nums. And so what this does is it takes all the parameters that are given and puts them inside a single array so that they can all be iterated over, and the values, each of the individual values can still be processed. And so you can rename this to my product so that we know it's not just 3 times 4 anymore. And so what we can do to find the product of all the numbers in the array is first create a variable to store the product, so we can call it this product, and then let's set it equal to 1 by default, and then we can iterate through each of the numbers using a for of loop. So for a num of nums, we can change this to const2 because the numbers aren't changing. And so then what we can do is multiply this product by each number. So this product equals this product times nums. And because we're just multiplying this product with an additional number and reassigning it back to this product, we can also just use the asterisk equals operator to just multiply nums by this product and reassign it. It's just a shorthand notation. And then at this point, we're done multiplying all the numbers together, so we can just return this product. And so now that means we can we can provide an unlimited amount of numbers, any numbers that we want. So let's just do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And after fixing this mistake so that it multiplies by the number instead of the numbers array, you can see 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 is 120. And that's what this function has calculated for us. So this allows us to have an unlimited number of arguments, essentially. This concludes episode 23 of the Building Interactive Website series. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and make sure to look out for episode 24.